Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. Today we're taking an updated look at the current generation flagship Radeon and GeForce GPUs, so the 7900 XTX and RTX 4090. Of course, the GeForce GPU, it is faster, but right now it does also cost $2,000 US, whereas you can pick up the 7900 XTX for just under $1,000 US, so a little under half the price there. And that's a massive difference. So is the RTX 4090 really worth such a significant premium? Well, before we find out, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new 12th gen CPU contact frame by DeBauer. It's well known that the integrated loading mechanism, or ILM, of the LGA 1700 sockets bends 12th gen CPUs, leading to an uneven contact surface that reduces cooling performance. Solving this issue, the contact frame replaces the ILM, allowing for a much more even contact with the CPU's IHS and the base of your cooler, which in turn reduces operating temperatures. Installation's quick and easy, and thanks to the use of anodized aluminium, the contact frame is non-conductive. And then, for those of you who wish to further maximize contact, Thermal Grizzly now offers an optional lapping tool, so for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so first up, for all the AMD fans screaming at their monitor, we know. We're well aware the 7900 XTX more directly competes with the RTX 4080, not the insanely expensive 4090. But we've also made that comparison already. We did so late last year, comparing the 7900 XTX and RTX 4080 in a range of games, featuring loads of rasterization, ray tracing, and even DLSS versus FSR upscaling benchmarks. So you can go watch that video if that's the comparison you want to see. As for this comparison, it really came about because of a recent Q&A question, where a viewer asked us a hypothetical question: would we purchase an RTX 4080 or a hypothetical GTX 4090, a GPU with the rasterization performance of the RTX 4090 with the price tag of the RTX 4080, as it lacked tensor cores and therefore couldn't take advantage of RTX features. As you'd expect, Tim and myself gave our answer, Tim opting for the RTX 4080, with myself preferring the idea of a GTX 4090 as I mostly play competitive multiplayer shooters. But what really surprised me was the reception from viewers, with a significant amount of commenters claiming that we already have a GTX 4090 type product. It's called the Radeon RX 7900 XTX. Last I checked though, the 7900 XTX was often quite a bit slower than the RTX 4090 for rasterization performance. So has something changed since we last looked? It seems very unlikely, but also there were quite a few new and visually exciting games released late last year, so I thought an updated comparison would make sense. So here we are. For testing, we're using our Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system with 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, and the display drivers used are Game Ready 546.33 and Adrenal Edition 23.12.1. Okay, I reckon it's about time we jumped into the data, so let's go do it. First up, we have results from the latest version of The Last of Us Part 1, and here the 7900 XTX was 23% slower at 1080p, 20% slower at 1440p, and then 21% slower at 4K. So good results overall for the XTX, I'd say, particularly given that at MSRP it's almost 40% cheaper, and at 4K we're looking at over 60 FPS without having to enable upscaling. And speaking of which, when using FSR and DLSS quality modes, we see big frame rate increases for both GPUs in this title. Here the XTX was 26% slower at 1080p, 20% slower at 1440p, and 22% slower at 4K. Next up we have Starfield, and again this data is based on the most up-to-date version of the game, at the time that this video went live anyway. At 1080p, the 7900 XTX is just 3% slower than the RTX 4090, then 12% slower at 1440p and 17% slower at 4K, so another set of positive results for the much cheaper Radeon GPU. Now, even if we enable upscaling, the margins remain much the same. So the XTX was 3% slower at 1080p, 11% slower at 1440p, and then 16% slower at 4K. Performance in Assassin's Creed Mirage is very competitive. Here the 7900 XTX was just 5% slower at 1080p, 11% slower at 1440p, and 19% slower at 4K. We're also looking at well over 100 FPS at 4K using the highest quality preset. Now, with FSR and DLSS enabled, the 7900 XTX is able to beat the RTX 4090 at 1080p and 1440p, offering 11% more frames at 1440p. That said, the Radeon GPU does fall behind at 4K, though only by a 13% margin. Moving on to Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, we see that neither GPU has any issues in this title, though as expected the RTX 4090 is faster, as here the XTX trailed by a 16% margin at 1080p, 20% at 1440p and then just 8% at 4K. However, what kills the Radeon GPU on this title is ray tracing. Switching it on using the high quality settings, we see that performance falls off a cliff. We're now just looking at 77 FPS at 1080p, making it almost 50% slower than the 4090. Actually, at 1440p, it's 52% slower and an insane 58% slower at 4K, or another way of looking at it, the RTX 4090 is nearly 140% faster at 4K. Now, enabling upscaling does help the 7900 XTX relative to the 4090, as now it is 42% slower at 1080p, 45% slower at 1440p, and then 50% slower at 4K. Next up, we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and here we find some heavily CPU limited results at 1080p, though frame rates are well north of 150 FPS. Still, the Radeon GPU is able to hit the lead due to requiring less CPU processing power, nudging ahead by a mere 3% margin. But once we hit the 1440p resolution, the 7900 XTX configuration becomes heavily GPU limited, and now it's 30% slower and then 32% slower at 4K. Now, with ray tracing enabled, the CPU load increases further, and as a result, the 7900 XTX is able to offer a rather substantial 18% performance increase over the RTX 4090, as the added CPU overhead from the GeForce GPU sees it become CPU limited much earlier. Because of this, even at 1440p, the margins are very similar, and it's not until we hit the 4K resolution that the results are GPU limited, as this sees the Radeon GPU fall behind by a 35% margin. Enabling FSR and DLSS doesn't do much in this title, as we are CPU limited for the most part at 1080p and 1440p, and in fact the overhead of these upscaling technologies actually has the opposite effect, reducing performance in most instances. But at 4K, where we are GPU limited, the 7900 XTX still only saw a 4% increase, whereas DLSS offered a much more substantial 25% boost for the RTX 4090. Forza Motorsport plays well using either GPU with the ultra quality preset, but even so, the RTX 4090 is faster, and as a result, the 7900 XTX was 23% slower at 1080p, and then 21% slower at 1440p and 4K. Now, enabling the full RTFX further favours the GeForce GPU, and now the 7900 XTX is 26% slower at 1080p, 28% slower at 1440p, and 30% slower at 4K. Again, we have another title where FSR doesn't appear to be working correctly, as we see almost no change in performance for the 7900 XTX with it enabled. Apparently DLSS has been broken in the past in this title, but that no longer appears to be the case, as we're seeing roughly a 40% increase across the board, which is about what you'd expect to see, so a massive performance advantage here for the RTX 4090. Next up we have Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, and without ray tracing enabled but using the Ultra preset, the 7900 XTX does very well, rendering 139 FPS at 1080p to make it just 18% slower than the RTX 4090, which admittedly 18%, yes, that is a big margin, but also does cost at least 40% less. So relative to the price, not a significant margin. All of that said though, at the more GPU limited 1440p resolution, the margin does balloon out to 37% and then 33% at 4K. But that is nothing. If we enable ray tracing using the ultra quality preset, the 7900 XTX gets decimated, rendering just 41 FPS at 1080p, making it 62% slower, or the 4090 161% faster. The margins remain much the same at 1440p and 4K, so this is a bad set of results for AMD, really bad. Now, enabling upscaling does allow the 7900 XTX to average 61 FPS at 1080p, but that's half the performance we're seeing from the RTX 4090, so again, a bad set of results here for AMD. Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered is a well-optimized title, so much so that we end up CPU limited even at 1440p. Therefore, we have to turn to 4K to see a difference in performance between these two GPUs, and here the XTX falls behind by a 24% margin. Enabling ray tracing, quite surprisingly, doesn't further favour the GeForce GPU as the game becomes more CPU limited, though the XTX was still 18% slower at 4K, but had the RTX 4090 not been capped to around 150 FPS, the margin could have been much larger. And with the game CPU limited, enabling upscaling doesn't really do much, though it does help the 1700 XTX close the gap at 4K. Hogwarts Legacy is another new game that's heavily CPU limited, even when using the best gaming CPUs available. As we've seen a few times now, when CPU limited, the 1700 XTX can beat the RTX 4090, and we're seeing that at 1080p and 1440p, while the 4K data is still very competitive. Enabling ray tracing reduced the 1700 XTX to similar levels of performance to that of the 4090, as both were CPU limited here. Then at 1440p it becomes 19% slower and a massive 39% slower at 4K. Enabling upscaling helps both GPUs out, especially at 4K, and now the 1700 XTX is just shy of 60 FPS, making it 19% slower than the 4090. Now, one of the newest games added to our list is Alan Wake 2, and here the Radeon GPU is surprisingly competitive. At 1080p it was just 12% slower, but we're also only seeing a 16% margin at 1440p and then 21% at 4K, which are, again, decent margins, but not when the 1700 XTX costs almost 40% less at MSRP. The problem for the Radeon GPU, rather, can be seen when enabling ray tracing. Here it falls flat on its face, delivering what I'd call unplayable performance with a measly 21 FPS at 1080p. The 4090 is hardly amazing here either, with just 66 FPS at 1080p and then 44 FPS at 1440p, but it is considerably better than the XTX. Of course, you can enable upscaling, and this does help the 4090 get up to a more respectable frame rate at 1080p and 1440p, though it does little to help out the 7900 XTX. Next up we have Fortnite using the epic quality settings, but in the DirectX 11 mode, and here the 7900 XTX is around 30% slower than the RTX 4090 at each tested resolution, so not amazing, but not bad either. However, if we opt for the more competitive medium quality settings, we find that at 1080p and 1440p, the XTX is over 40% slower. So not ideal for those of you trying to secure every competitive advantage possible. The margin is slightly reduced to 35% at 4K, but even so, that meant that the GeForce GPU was still a lot faster. Oddly, however, if we switch to the DirectX 12 API using the Epic preset with ray tracing enabled, the Radeon GPU is shockingly competitive and somehow even faster at 4K. I did triple check these results and I got the same data each time. Now, like Fortnite, Warzone highlights an issue for the Radeon GPUs when using competitive quality settings. For whatever reason, the section of the map we used for testing limited the 7900 XTX to around 200 FPS, and oddly this was seen regardless of the resolution used, which normally would suggest a strong CPU bottleneck. However, that's not the case, as the RTX 4090 was good for over 400 FPS at 1080p, and over 300 FPS at 1440p, making it 63% faster. Strangely though, they're very similar at 4K, so I'm not sure what the limitation is here for the Radeon GPU at the low resolutions, perhaps some kind of driver-related bug, but for those of you seeking maximum FPS in Warzone, it appears that for now, a GeForce GPU is the way to go. Also, enabling upscaling did little for either GPU using the basic quality preset, so you're probably better off running at the native resolution, especially for those of you who are gaming at 1080p. Unlike Fortnite and Warzone, performance in Rainbow Six Siege is a lot more competitive. The 7900 XTX was just 5% slower at 1080p, 12% slower at 1440p, and then 24% slower at 4K. So value for money, the Radeon GPU does do really well here, while enabling extremely high frame rates at resolutions such as 1440p. Finally, we're going to look at Counter-Strike 2 using the medium preset, and again, the 1700 XTX does quite well here, delivering comparable performance at 1080p, though the RTX 4090 is CPU limited, but both are spitting out over 500 FPS on average. Then at 1440p, the XTX was 18% slower than the CPU limited 4090, and then 26% slower at 4K, so good results overall. Okay, we included a lot more games, so I'm not going to go over all the data because it will take quite a bit of time. I've just looked at the interesting/new games, And the rest of the games, we're just going to look at a simple breakdown graph, which we have here. And this is a look at the 1080p data, just the rasterization performance. So I've removed any RT or upscaling results from this particular graph. And on average, we see that the 1700 XTX was 12% slower than the RTX 4090, which isn't that dissimilar to our day one 1700 XTX review, which saw the Radeon GPU trailing by a 5% margin. And the main difference there being that we were using the 5800X 3D, whereas we're now using the faster 7800X 3D, so it does alleviate the CPU bottleneck a bit more at the lower 1080p resolution. Now, increasing the resolution of 1440p allows the RTX 4090 to pull further ahead, and now the 1700 XTX is seen to be 18% slower on average, though we did see margins as great as 44%. Still, that is a good result overall for the Radeon GPU if you factor in the price difference. Then at 4K, the margin grows to 21%, which again is good for AMD given the 1700 XTX is 40% cheaper at MSRP. And this margin is also in line with our day one review data, using the slower 5800X 3D, where the 1700 XTX was on average 20% slower. Now, the big issue for AMD is still ray tracing performance, and we see that here when looking at the 1080p results, where the 1700 XTX is already 22% slower, with a number of titles showing margins greater than 40%. But things only get worse at 1440p. Here the 1700 XTX is on average 28% slower, and again, we see several examples, such as Dying Light 2, Ratchet and Clank, Cyberpunk and Alan Wake 2, where the Radeon GPU gets completely destroyed. Now, even the RTX 4090 wasn't always usable at 4K with ray tracing enabled, so in a number of instances these margins are a bit meaningless, but still, here the 1700 XTX was 34% slower on average. Now, in the games that we were able to test with ray tracing enabled along with FSR and DLSS upscaling, we see that at 1080p, the 1700 XTX was on average 27% slower, so a reasonable performance advantage for the RTX 4090, even at this low resolution. That margin does, however, increase in the GeForce GPU's favour at 1440p, as here the 1700 XTX was on average 33% slower. Again, we're seeing some pretty massive losses for the Radeon GPU in titles such as Ratchet and Clank, Forza Motorsport, Cyberpunk, and Alan Wake 2. Then finally, at 4K, the Radeon GPU was on average 42% slower, which isn't a good result for AMD as it makes the RTX 4090 look like a decent value proposition relative to what the 1700 XTX was able to achieve here. So, would you buy the Radeon RX 7900 XT or the GeForce RTX 4090? Or in other words, are you looking at spending $1,000 US or $2,000 US? And as I noted at the start of this video, despite being flagship products from competing companies, they're not exactly competing products. If you're willing to spend $1,600 US, or right now it'd have to be $2,000 US to acquire the RTX 4090, you're unlikely to even consider the 7900 XTX. Likewise, if you're considering the 7900 XTX, it's extremely unlikely that you'd be tossing up between it and the RTX 4090. Rather, you'd be more likely considering possibly stepping up to the RTX 4080. So in a sense, it's a bit of a pointless comparison, but I knew that going into it. Still, it's nice to have an updated look at AMD and Nvidia's best offerings. Essentially though, if you want the best of the best, it's got to be the RTX 4090. The thing sells itself to those of you with oodles of money. The 1700 XTX, on the other hand, really has to battle for your money, and while it might be 18% cheaper than even the RTX 4080 for similar performance overall, though often much worse ray tracing performance, its feature set can be lacking, either in support or quality. Still, at around 20% cheaper is where I'd really start gravitating towards the 1700 XTX, especially if I wasn't too fussed about RT performance, which admittedly I'm still currently not, though of course it is nice to have if you don't have to pay a notable premium. What the 1700 XTX isn't is a hypothetical GeForce GTX 4090. Its rasterization performance, it's just not fast enough, but it's also better than that, I'd argue, as the ray tracing performance is generally acceptable, especially for those of you who prioritize visuals over frame rate. Anyway, as I see it, the big problem for AMD is Radeon performance in popular competitive titles such as Fortnite and Warzone. If you crank up the visual settings, the Radeon GPUs are pretty acceptable in those competitive titles, especially Fortnite when using DirectX 12, but that isn't really the best way to play Fortnite, if you're doing so competitively, and nor are the high quality visuals. This hands Nvidia a big advantage, and it's why most Warzone and Fortnite players prefer to use GeForce GPUs. And I've played a lot of Fortnite with a Radeon GPU, and the experience can be anywhere from great to downright horrible. New game updates can often break driver optimization, or at least this appears to be what's happening, and this results in frequent stuttering that makes the game unenjoyable to play, and this can persist for weeks or even months until AMD addresses it. Again, using DX12 can help, but performance there is generally weaker, and you'll probably see occasional stuttering, which is why the performance mode is based on the DirectX 11 API, and it's what every single pro player uses. All of that said, it really does depend on the game or games you play. My in-game testing for Counter-Strike 2 was very positive for the 1700 XTX, and we saw much the same in Rainbow Six Siege. So it can be a great GPU for esports titles. So as always, do your research, check the performance in the games that you happen to be playing. And that is going to do it for this super pointless video, as I'm sure some will point out in the comment section, no doubt. And as I said, we know this is a 4080 competitor. Already made that video, so search for 1700 XTX versus RTX 4080 in the Hardware Unboxed channel, and you will find it from late last year. Yeah, that's going to do it for this one. Float Plane Patreon, you can sign up to either one of those things if you want to get more Hardware Unboxed goodness. You will also get access to more graphs for this video for the games that we didn't look at the individual results for, just due to runtime and whatnot. Yeah, it's a cool place because you get access to our exclusive Discord server, and that is a cool place to hang out, talk tech, and Tim and myself are active there. Behind the scenes content, live streams, Q&As, a lot of cool stuff, so check it out if you're interested, but if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.